We believe conservatism to be the most natural political tendency, rooted in man's taste for the familiar, for family, and for faith in God.
Thank you to the American Conservative. This is a remarkable platform.
And it's always welcoming when I come into a room like this and I can see the backdrop, the American Conservative.
I'm a great admirer. Your website, it's one of the things you think about certain websites that you go to a lot, and the appearance of it is just like going home.
Your magazine is a favorite of mine.
The American Conservative magazine is one of the most important publications of our times.
Really thanks to the American Conservative, a publication that I'm very much indebted to. You may know that when Hillbilly Elegy, my book, came out in June of 2016, it was received reasonably well, but wasn't even close to making the bestseller list. And then I gave an interview on the American Conservative website, and I checked the Amazon ranking of my book. As any author will know, you check it obsessively in the age of the modern internet. I noticed that it had leaped up to the top of the Amazon bestseller list. And around that same time, I got an email from Rod telling me that we'd crashed the servers. So I appreciate everything that the American Conservative has done on my behalf, and really on the behalf of this broader movement.
I want to thank the American Conservative for hosting this event and for all of you for being here. It's good for conservatives to get together and talk about what it means to be a conservative, what it is that we're conserving, why it is that the things that we're trying to conserve need to be conserved, and what the risks are for not conserving them.
But perhaps instead, the American people will hear the rally cry and think, at last, the turn begins. Let us restore our nation together.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm glad to hear that so many people are enjoying the good company that we have here this evening. My name is Emil Doak. I'm the Executive Director of the American Conservative. On behalf of our staff and board of directors, welcome to the American Conservative's 2023 Annual Gala. This is now the fifth TAC Gala that I personally have been involved in. This started back with our 15th anniversary gala, the first event of this kind that we put on back in 2018. I've been at the magazine for only a year at that point. And as I look out on this room full of some of the most important people and organizations in the conservative movement, it's really striking to me how much has changed since we gathered in a room that was about half this size just 6 years ago. As many of you know, this magazine has presented a challenge to the right of center consensus throughout its history. From our very first editorial, which you saw quoted in the opening video just now, and which, if you know me, you know that I quote it way too often, we declared that we would be different. We would question the benefits and point to the pitfalls of the global free trade economy. We would take seriously the challenge of assimilation and the dangers of an open border that is still way too open. And we would discuss frequently America's role in the world, challenging the go-it-alone militarism that too often dominates our political discourse and distorts this country's actual interests. It is, as you saw at the very beginning of that video, some in the back may not have seen it, but if you were in the front, as you saw at the very beginning of that video, a conservatism that prioritizes a taste for the familiar, for family, and for faith in God. And as I reflect on my tenure here at TAC, it's been interesting to see how this vision both attracts and manifests different parts of this TAC coalition. We have the anti-war right, whose animating political issue is staunch foreign policy realism and restraint, and who have long been a bedrock of this magazine. That's no surprise, as we were a publication that launched as a lonely conservative stand against the disastrous war in Iraq. And I think that we owe all of those who took that lonely stand in those early days a debt of gratitude. And we have different factions of what might be called the old right, who have similarly always had a home here at the American Conservative. The constructive tension between paleo-conservatives, whose staunch defense of traditional American freedoms and values found an avatar in one of our founders, Pat Buchanan, and the more folk libertarian elements that were later attracted to the campaigns of Ron Paul, have long played out in our pages. It's an important conversation, and it gets to the heart of the tension inherent in the adjective and noun of ordered liberty. And then more recently, as our magazine has grown and our movement has grown, we've seen new groups taking a liking to TAC's preference for the familiar and for family and for faith in God. Localists, whose skepticism of big government is not necessarily driven by libertarian convictions, have emerged as an important part of the TAC coalition, perhaps most prominently represented by longtime TAC columnist Bill Kaufman. His column is always a must-read for me in the issues of the print magazine. I'm glad we have one Bill Kaufman, or one print magazine reader here today. This skepticism of big government, both its localist and folk libertarian forms, is now at times pitted against new elements of an emergent new right that are more comfortable with using the levers of state power for conservative ends. This is most notably presented in national conservatism and post-liberalism. These two strains, I think, are different in important ways, but both emphasize conserving the permanent things, faith and family foremost among them, which puts them squarely within the TAC coalition. And what might be called an emergent pro-worker conservatism that is challenging the right's economic consensus has found a home in our pages as well, in no small part due to our long-standing divergence from the party line on the issue of trade. Now, I think at its best, this TAC coalition exists in healthy tension, with each camp offering vital contributions to our publication. Now, these can at times challenge each other, but the task of the magazine is to coalesce these disparate strands into a coherent vision for this country. That's one guided by that taste for the familiar, for family, and for faith in God. Now, for me, I've long felt that this magazine is an intellectual home, in no small part because my own intellectual interests span the many camps that have a home in this magazine. But while my head might be drawn to these different camps, in my heart, I'm a localist. I look to live out those traditional American values of faith and family in my particular place. Indeed, I'm deeply shaped by my hometown and my home state of Virginia. I'm proud that we have the Virginia flag here on the stage today. And after all, I think that's no surprise. I met my wife there. She's here tonight, my wife, Kelsey. We met a long time ago at Drainsville Elementary. We started dating in high school, and both our families are still rooted in our hometown. Nearly every place in that town triggers fond, familiar memories for us, and that's how the taste for the familiar, for family, and for faith in God manifests itself for me. Now, I should clarify, though, if you know me, you know that my hometown is not some idyllic small town whose main streets lend their name to the type of community that this magazine seeks to defend. I'm from Herndon, Virginia. If you're from the DC area, you know that that's just another crappy suburb. It's about 25 miles west of here. And it's a town that's changed a lot in recent decades, in no small part due to the tax dollars that flow into the agencies and contractors that dominate Northern Virginia and depend on federal spending in foreign wars. So as my kids get older, we have 3 wonderful daughters now, the tensions that we explore in this magazine become much more concrete. And finding a community and living a lifestyle that can instill in my kids the values that we fight for every day at TAC becomes far more imperative. As many of you in this room know, this will be my last gala as TAC's executive director. I'll be stepping down at the end of the year, and my family and I will be moving to the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. I'll be working to grow a faithful Catholic school for my kids. Or in other words, I've decided that the time is right for my family and me to live TAC's mission more fully outside of DC and to work directly to build the kind of vital institutions of civil society that we at TAC fiercely defend in our pages every day. Now, part of how I know that the time is right for my family to make this move is reflected in this room today. As I mentioned, at our first annual gala nearly 6 years ago, we were a scrappy magazine, still very much an outsider to the conservative movement. We were offering a sharp critique of what passed for conservatism here in the Beltway. Now, today, as we sit here in 2023, we are joined by some of the most influential organizational or conservative organizations from across Washington and beyond. Just look at whom you'll hear from later in this program. Our Conservative Mind Award winner, Michael Knowles, reaches millions through his top-rated talk show and is a contributor to our magazine. Our Lifetime Achievement Award winner, Ambassador Jack Matlock, oversaw the fall of the Soviet Union and his prescient expertise on Eastern European politics has been reflected by the ongoing war in Ukraine. And our keynote speaker, Dr. Kevin Roberts, is reinvigorating the most important conservative think tank in the country and ensuring that conservatives of all stripes are putting American interests first. That plucky coalition of misfits that has long made up our magazine has been vindicated. But I don't think it's good enough for us to sit back on our laurels and to crow about how we were right. As I step aside, I know that this is TAC's political moment. The magazine is poised to seed it and to lead. And to do so, it will be the task of TAC's next leader to transcend and expand that original plucky coalition, to not only unify the disparate strains of the emergent new right, but to direct them into a coherent and powerful governing philosophy that reflects the values that have always animated this magazine. After all, this has always been the task of middlebrow magazines of ideas. National Review birthed an incredibly politically potent movement by playing a similar coalitional role in the 50s. But the issues facing this country now, testing those timeless conservative principles, are much different than they were 70 years ago. Donald Trump's election exposed the vast chasm between the priorities of official conservatism just across the river in Washington. I'm glad we're not there, by the way. We're on the right side of the river. And the voters that it purports to represent. I believe that this magazine has navigated the tumult of the post-2016 years quite strategically and is uniquely poised to seize the mantle as the emerging right's coalitional magazine. So this is the task ahead of our magazine in the critical months and years ahead. And I'm proud that we have compiled the pieces necessary for the magazine's next leader to achieve even greater heights than we have in recent years. We've rebuilt our internal infrastructure, modernizing our operations to allow the organization to scale. And we've revamped our website to offer premium content to our members for the first time, while also creating important new revenue streams for the organization. We forged deep relationships with important stakeholders throughout Washington and beyond, which is reflected here tonight. And perhaps most importantly, we've built a great dynamic staff full of some of the brightest writers and editors working today. I hope that you all have a chance to meet our excellent staff here tonight. And I thank them for all of their incredibly hard work, both to keep a dynamic website and magazine going and to plan this wonderful evening that we have here tonight. I'll continue to guide TAC throughout the transition this fall. And while our board of directors is hard at work figuring out what comes next, I have full confidence that the best is yet to come for this special magazine. I'm grateful to all of you here for joining us tonight, for your readership and support of this magazine, and especially to those who have made tonight possible. George O'Neill Jr., William Benter, Don Sebastiani and Sons. If you like the wine that was provided to us by Don Sebastiani, there's a note in your program about that as well. As well as American Moment, Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. Both those groups are doing incredible work to ensure that our next conservative presidential administration is staffed by actual conservatives. As well as the American Principles Project, the Conservative Partnership Institute, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, Them Before Us, and all of our supporters and partners listed in your program. Now, before I leave you to enjoy the conversation at dinner, it is time for us to thank him to whom we should be most grateful for all of our blessings. So I'm proud tonight to invite Pastor Corey Brooks to the stage to offer tonight's invocation. Please join me in welcoming Pastor Corey Brooks.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and fellow patriots. Tonight we gather at the American Conservative Gala not merely as spectators, but as stewards of a sacred cause. In this moment, we must remember the profound importance of the issues this magazine champions, especially for communities like mine, which face unique challenges. In our current community on the south side of Chicago, the breakdown of the family is a stark reality. Nearly 80% of our households are single-parent households. This is a cry for help, a challenge that demands our attention, and not just our attention, but our action. We need the American Conservative because it addresses the crises, championing the importance of strong families as the bedrock of society. It offers solutions to strengthen the family units, to heal the wounds of broken homes, and to empower parents with the support that they so desperately need. But it is just not the family. It is about America. We need the American Conservative because in a nation where we are shared values are under siege, the magazine is a defender of the principles that bind us together. We need the American Conservative because it stands as a bedrock and a bulwark against the erosion of individual liberties, the encroachment of big government, and the assault on free speech. It is a champion of the First Amendment, preserving our sacred right to express our views and beliefs. We need the American Conservative because it calls for us to return to a society where family values are cherished, where the sanctity of life is upheld, and where traditional morals are revered. It offers a path forward in a world that often seems adrift. We need the American Conservative because it reminds us that the heart of America lies in its communities, where local self-reliance, strong neighborhoods, and shared values are the bedrock of our nation. It champions a vision where America emanates from the bottom up, not the top down. As we convene tonight, we invoke the spirit of unity, hope, and determination, knowing that the American Conservative is an individual ally in our mission to protect and uphold these cherished ideas. Let its stories inspire us to work tirelessly, to advocate for a return to these principles that we hold so dear, and to ensure that America remains a beacon of liberty and opportunity, not just for some, but for all. Thank you for joining us in this noble endeavor, and may the idea shared here tonight rekindle the flame of conservatism and fortify the very foundations of our great nation. Let's pray. Tonight, Lord, fill us with your grace. Lord God, as we make decisions that might affect us and all of those around us, and continue to remind us that all we do here tonight, all that we accomplish is for the pursuit of truth, for the greater glory of you, and for the service of humanity. We ask these things in your name. God bless America. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, Pastor. Thank all of you, and enjoy your dinner. We will be back shortly. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I have the honor tonight of presenting 2 awards before our keynote address. The first of which is our Conservative Mind Award. We're big fans of Russell Kirk here at the American Conservative, so when we devised our award for young leaders, we thought there was nothing better to name the award after than Kirk's seminal work, The Conservative Mind, which he published at just age 35. Well, tonight's winner, I believe, is actually younger than that. He can correct me if I'm wrong. But even with his young age, he has emerged as one of the most influential conservative voices in media today. Michael Knowles is, as I'm sure all of you are well aware, the host of the wildly popular Michael Knowles Show at the Daily Wire, and the #1 best-selling author of multiple books, including Reasons to Vote for Democrats, which I have to say is just an impeccably argued piece of work. He has included every reason possible in that book. And then his latest and first book that includes words, Speechless, Controlling Words and Controlling Minds. I mentioned in my opening remarks that the ideas that have animated this magazine since the beginning now have a foothold across the conservative movement. And I think there's perhaps no better example of that than Michael. He has an uncanny knack for conveying really deep, complex issues in a relatable way. And he does so with his trademark wit and humor as well. He's been a great friend to our publication. He's been a contributor to our pages, and I'm honored to present him with our Conservative Mind Award tonight. Please join me in welcoming Michael Knowles.
This is very cool. It's very heavy. Most exercise I've had in a long time. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. I want to thank Emil and all of my friends here at the American Conservative for this honor. The timing really, really worked out well. As this trip to DC approached, I feared that in addition to accepting this award, I would also have to accept the speakership of the House of Representatives. Which, as far as I'm concerned, that is a fate worse than death. I wouldn't wish it on my very worst enemy. So I hear that that issue has been resolved, which I'm very happy to see. Now we can turn our attention away from the House Speaker race towards simpler matters, such as the outbreak of World War III. There is a certain providence in attending a TAC gala at this moment, as the liberal establishment on both parties once again beats war drums for another open-ended conflict in the Middle East and elsewhere, with little, if any, regard for how much this conflict could cost the United States, how such a conflict might end, what unintended consequences might result, or even which vital American interests, if any, are involved. We find ourselves at precisely the same predicament that spurred the founding of this magazine in 2002. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Has anything actually changed in the last 21 years? Yes, I think. It is sometimes said that Barry Goldwater did not lose his presidential run in 1964. It just took 16 years to count the votes. Goldwater was ahead of his time, perhaps, but he was ultimately vindicated in the election of Ronald Reagan. The same might be said of Pat Buchanan's 1992 run for president. It took 24 years to count the votes, but ultimately he prevailed. A few years ago, I revisited Mr. Buchanan's famous culture war speech from the 1992 Republican National Convention. I ended up quoting the speech extensively in my book, Speechless, because the speech reads like prophecy. The man was proven right on every single point. The same might be said of those early issues of the American Conservative and the debates over the Iraq War, mass migration, trade, and globalization. The American Conservative did not, in fact, lose those debates, no matter how it may have looked at the time. It just took a decade and a half to tally up the score. Today, the neoconservatism against which TAC formed is in retreat, and an older, more durable conservatism is ascendant. So just what is that ascendant style of conservatism? Some call it paleo, some call it populist. Still others call it traditional or national, or even, dare I say, integralist. A friend once observed to me that obscure political monikers are the right-wing version of gender pronouns. Fair enough. But there is one crucial difference between self-conceptions of the decadent left and the ascendant right. When the left uses silly monikers to describe itself, it conveys its abnormality, its deviance from accepted norms and standards. When we on the right use our respective identifiers, we do so in order to convey normality. Paleo, populist, traditional, national, even integralist. In other words, those words just mean old, common, enduring, patriotic, and religious. To put it even more bluntly, they mean normal. This, I think, is my entire political ideology. I want things to be normal. I want to live in a country that is good and civilized and normal. I think people ought to endeavor as often and as much as possible to be normal. Seems simple enough, and yet it's so difficult. If that were the rule, I suspect roughly 90% of our particularly modern political problems would disappear overnight. Such a rule is unsatisfying to eggheads and ideologues, but what it lacks in theoretical precision, it makes up for in prudence, which even the eggheads and the ideologues might recall is for Aristotle and every wise political thinker since the paramount political virtue. To be normal is to conform to a standard. Standards can be conscious, but they don't have to be. One can help a little old lady across the street because he finds paragraph 17 of some minor work of Alistair MacIntyre to be more persuasive than paragraph 57 of a major work of David Hume. I suppose that could be the justification. And I'm all for reading Alistair MacIntyre, so I don't mean to knock that mode at all. But one could also help the little old lady cross the street because his parents raised him right, and that's just what one does. To be normal does not require any special book learning. It certainly does not require initiation into the esoteric Gnostic cults of the various ideologues. To be normal is to follow our highest natural inclinations as creatures made in the image and likeness of God. It is to make proper use of our will in accordance with our reason, and thereby to discipline our appetites and become truly free. Put another way, to be normal is to listen to your grandparents, to follow the lessons and emulate the behaviors that have endured throughout the ages because they have been especially conducive to human flourishing, whether people have considered them consciously or not. That's my kind of conservatism. And, coincidentally, that is precisely the political vision laid out in TAC's founding editorial. In the words of the founding editors, we believe conservatism to be the most natural political tendency, rooted in man's taste for the familiar, for family, for faith in God. We believe that true conservatism has a predisposition for the institutions and mores that exist. So much of what passes for contemporary conservatism is wedded to a kind of radicalism. Absolutely spot on. It is a scandal that so much of what has passed for contemporary conservatism has intentionally undermined all of those tastes and predispositions. We've all lived under the consequent policies. We've all read the so-called think pieces. The conservative case for open borders. The conservative case for redefining marriage, the fundamental political institution. The conservative case for drag queen story hour. You remember that one? What a case that was. Mercifully, such radicalism is on the run, and at least for the past 7 or so years, normal conservatism has once again ascended. The sole conservative consolation during these decades of confusion and then radicalism that followed the Cold War, was an insight that I gleaned from Russell Kirk. Fitting, obviously, given the title of this award. The insight is that reality always reasserts itself in the end. One cannot live in ideological fantasy forever. And when reality does reassert itself, those who never fell for the fantasy will look like prophets. It is always an honor to receive an award. It is a special honor to receive an award from people who continue to be proven right from the start. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. That was fantastic. As I mentioned, the trademark wit and humor is always there with Michael Knowles. Well, our next award is our Lifetime Achievement Award. This is presented to leaders who have devoted their careers to advancing tax principles in the public square. And there's perhaps no one who better exemplifies those principles given the current uncertainty that is happening on the world stage than tonight's honoree. Ambassador Jack Matlock is a career diplomat who has served on the front lines of American diplomacy during the Cold War. He was deeply involved in the peaceful resolution of the Cold War, serving as U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1987 to 1991 under both President Reagan and President Bush. And since the end of the Cold War, Ambassador Matlock has focused on applying the lessons from that experience to the public policy issues of today. And I think that unlike too many in the foreign policy establishment, Ambassador Matlock realized that the geopolitical realities really did change significantly after the fall of the Soviet Union. In a 1997 testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Ambassador Matlock had the courage to be a lonely voice against expanding NATO, saying, quote, "I think that to bring in new members at this time under these conditions is a misguided policy. And if it should be approved by the Senate, that it should go down in history as a profound strategic blunder." Well, in the over 25 years since now, we've seen a dramatic expansion of NATO. And in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, war hawks on both sides of the aisle, just across the river in Washington, are escalating our involvement, risking a hot war with the nuclear power. As has been the case numerous times throughout his career, Ambassador Matlock has been proven right. Now, we at TAC were honored to have Ambassador Matlock speak at our 2017 Foreign Policy Conference. This was one of the first events that I was involved with during my tenure at TAC. We held it at George Washington University, so we had many students in attendance. And I still remember that of all of the distinguished speakers that we had there that year at that conference, the one for whom I received the most media and meeting requests was Ambassador Matlock. And I think that speaks to just how important his career has been. It's our honor to have him join us here tonight and present him with TAC's Lifetime Achievement Award. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Jack Matlock.
Well, thank you very much. You know, if I have achieved anything, it has not been in any way a solo performance. I have been lucky enough to have support in many ways for the things we were trying to do. First of all, I would say I had support throughout my marriage to the late Rebecca, who worked with me and became, I think, very influential in improving the image of the United States with the people in the Soviet Union. I was also lucky enough, when I was ambassador to the Soviet Union, to have probably the finest diplomatic staff that the United States has ever enjoyed. We had diplomats who had contacts as Gorbachev was opening up the country, throughout the country, and they were able to report things that were going on so that we understood better than President Gorbachev what was happening in his own country, because he was being fed often lies by the KGB. Now, I'm delighted this evening that 3 of our diplomats who worked with us in Moscow are with us this evening. They too worked as husband and wife team. And I'm very happy to have John Evans and his wife, Donna, and also Richard Miles and his wife, Sharon, and Raymond Smith and his wife, Ann Miller. Let me tell you that the embassy in Moscow reported 18 months before it happened that the Soviet Union was likely to break up. This is before anyone, including the CIA, thought that was possible. That telegram was written by Raymond Smith, who is here this evening. And I'm very glad that they can be with us. But most of all, it was the pleasure and privilege of working with Ronald Reagan and George Shultz, who took on many of the people in the Reagan administration who argued that you couldn't negotiate with the Soviet Union, you only had to oppose them and bring them down. And you know, over a period of about 4 years, we went from the sort of confrontation the Europeans were calling a second Cold War to what was the ideological end of the Cold War at the time the Reagan administration ended. Now, that would not have happened if we had not had in the Soviet Union at that time Mikhail Gorbachev as the leader and Edward Shevardnadze as the foreign minister. The fact that these people, Reagan and Gorbachev, Shultz and Shevardnadze, were able to cultivate a relationship of openness and striving for the same end, because they all understood that the Cold War made no sense, and that we were putting into arms, and particularly nuclear weapons, enough to destroy the earth of humanity if they were all used. This made no sense to either. And so behind the negotiations. But there were, as I think now, about how different our diplomacy was then and what maybe passes for it, or it hardly deserves the name today. I would point out just a few things. At the height of the Cold War, President Reagan wrote just a few pages of what he expected in his first meeting with Gorbachev. And first of all, he recognized that Gorbachev was not a dictator, that he had to answer back to the Politburo, and therefore he couldn't be made to seem the loser. Second, he made observations about the importance of human rights and why dealing with this publicly, and I would say accusing them, was actually going to hurt the ones, and that what we support for human rights had to be carried out privately. And he made it his main task to develop a relationship with Gorbachev. And he ended by saying, whatever we achieve, we must not call it victory. Now, obviously, I don't have time to go through the various steps, but I will say that when they last met in December 1988, just a few weeks before President Reagan ended his term of office, Reagan noted in his diary, his private diary, that Gorbachev and I parted as partners to make a better world. Now, what happened then? Well, the Cold War certainly had ended by 1989 with the liberation of Eastern Europe. And but then suddenly we started saying, and this was first said by President Bush, the first President Bush, we won the Cold War. Now, wait a minute. We negotiated an end to the Cold War to the benefit of everybody. There were no losers, there were only winners. Then the second thing was that the Soviet Union broke up finally in December 91. And people started saying, oh, this is a great victory in the Cold War. It wasn't. While we had steadfastly maintained that the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, should be granted their independence, we never recognized they were part of the Soviet Union. And by the way, the last official act of the Soviet State Council, when Gorbachev was still president, recognized the independence of these three Baltic countries. But we were not trying to break up the Soviet Union. In fact, Reagan had excluded trying to break up the Soviet Union because he knew that if you try to do it, you're going to simply make them stronger and more hostile because of outside power. And also President Bush, who had used the phrase, we won the Cold War, when he saw that he might lose the election for re-election. But he also understood that it was not in the American interest for the Soviet Union to break up so long as Gorbachev was trying to democratize the country and had already renounced the Marxist-Leninist ideology. And therefore, he made his speech in Kiev. I think it was September 2nd, 1991, when he warned the Ukrainian Rada against suicidal nationalism. However, that speech was called by here his Chicken Kiev speech. But actually, he was profoundly right. But then we began to act as if, in fact, Russia was a defeated country. And we, over time, did not answer any of their requests to be included in European security and their own things guaranteed. Now, underlying all of this, I think there has been, I would say, a profound philosophical mistake in what we began to assume. I want to read you one quote from one quote from a famous article by Francis Fukuyama, 1993, in a book called The End of History. Quote, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period in post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." I guess when I read it, what a claim. And then attached to this was the idea that we are now the sole superpower. Well, yes, we had the strongest military, the strongest economy, but the idea that that gave us the power to transform other countries. After all, if democracy is the rule of the people by and for the people, how can outsiders create it? And the fact is they can't. And to embark on a road that you would, even by military force if necessary, try to change other governments, I think was not only extremely, I would say almost naive, but it was also a repeat of the mistake the Soviet Union had made. After all, what we call the Brezhnev Doctrine was predicated on the Marxian prediction by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, that the world would be what they call socialist by revolution. And therefore, the Brezhnev Doctrine was that if another state had achieved socialism, it was the responsibility of the Soviet Union to preserve that. And that was their excuse for invading countries in Eastern Europe when they began to try to throw off the communist control. We seem to start to doing the same thing in the name of democracy. Now let me just conclude by quoting from some prominent Americans regarding some of these issues I've talked about. The first I'd like to quote is Senator Fulbright, the only senator who voted against the Vietnam War from the very beginning. He wrote, "Power tends to confuse itself with virtue, and a great nation is particularly susceptible to the idea that its power is a sign of God's favor, conferring upon it a special responsibility for other nations, to make them richer or happier or wiser, to remake them, that is, in its own shining image. Power confuses itself with virtue and tends also to take itself for omnipotence. Once imbued with the idea of a mission, a great nation easily assumes that it has the means as well as the duty to do God's work." The second, I want to quote from one of our great warriors who also became president, Dwight Eisenhower. In his farewell speech, this is what he said: "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron." I think many of us remember the advice in George Washington's, to reach back in our history, the advice in George Washington's farewell address, to avoid any entangling alliances. He recognized that sometimes alliances are necessary in an emergency. But he said, that we should never confuse another country's interests with our own. But finally, I'm sure that most of us recall the phrase that John Quincy Adams used in his address to the American people on July 1st, 1821. However, I think it is important, although it's a little long, to listen to what he said and how he concluded. Listen to this. Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will America's heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will recommend the general cause by the countenance of her voice and the benignant sympathy of her example. She well knows that by once enlisting other banners than her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assumed the colors and usurped the standard of freedom. The fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. The frontlet upon her brow would no longer beam with the ineffable splendor of freedom and independence, but in its stead would soon be substituted an imperial diadem, flashing in false and tarnished luster in the murky radiance of dominion and power. Friends, isn't that where we are now?
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Ambassador Matlock. And that brings us now to tonight's keynote address. And this is from Dr. Kevin Roberts. Kevin, as I'm sure all of you know, was named president of the Heritage Foundation in 2021. And he has led an incredible reinvigoration of that venerable institution. He came to Heritage after serving as chief executive officer of the Texas Public Policy Foundation in Austin. And it was while he was at TPPF that I first met Kevin. This was back in 2020, those dark days when our country seemed to have lost their mind and said that we all needed to be shut down and stuck in our houses and put weird mouth diapers on our faces. And by the way, if you want to read more about those dark days, please read the current issue that's on your chairs. Our own Helen Andrews has a great retrospective on all the horrible things that were done to us then. But back then in 2020, we at TAC were supposed to host a book event for Rod Dreher's newly published bestseller, Live Not by Lies. The only problem, though, was that book event was scheduled for California. And of course, the COVID lockdown insanity was really centered in Gavin Newsom's state. So we weren't able to host an event there, and we had to scramble to find another venue for our event. Now, I knew that Texas was a free state, They had a dynamic conservative think tank in Austin, and we had some mutual connections with TPPF. So I approached Kevin about TAC hosting an event at their headquarters. And he was incredibly welcoming to us. He was gracious and helpful throughout the whole thing. And as anyone who knows Kevin Roberts knows, that is entirely within his character. So when Kevin was named the next president of Heritage just a couple years ago, I was thrilled. Not only because he had been friendly to us at TAC, but because I knew that this was someone who understood that the conservative movement is a coalition and that we are most effective in turning this country around when we work together rather than against each other. So this is the spirit that he's brought to Heritage, perhaps most notably in the ambitious Project 2025 presidential project. That's something that we at TAC are proud to be a part of, that seeks to unite and leverage the resources and knowledge of the conservative movement to serve the next conservative president. Kevin has been incredibly kind to our magazine. He has frequently published op-eds in our pages. And on a personal note, he has been an incredible counsel to me as well in leading this organization. We are honored to have him here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Roberts.
Thanks, Emil, and thank you all for having me. I think you, in spite of all your wisdom, Emil, selected the wrong keynote speaker. I think that was already Ambassador Matlock. Another round of applause for that great national treasure. All of us here, sir, will remember those remarks for the rest of our lives. Thank you and your staff for your heroism. God bless you. And Michael Knowles, you're not bad yourself. Great comments. Congratulations, my friend. Let me say to all of you that the American conservative, of course, has flourished. It will continue to flourish. But I would be remiss if one of my best friends in this business, Emil Doak, is not recognized one more time. Hats off, Emil, for a job well done, and God bless you. And I'll get to it, but one last group of people, considering what the ambassador has said and what Michael covered and what I'm about to talk about, which ultimately is in the spirit of what I call a fraternal correction to friends in the movement. If you are a veteran of the armed forces, please raise your hand or stand if you can so that we can recognize your service to this country. God bless you. Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. And to be honest, it is a little intimidating if I think about those of you who are here following wonderful remarks by the ambassador and by Michael. You see, up here, as opposed to being at individual tables or in certain corners of the reception, I get to see the whole rodeo. And you're an impressive lot. And those of you who are at the beginning of your careers are impressive. Basically, as I scan the audience, I'm looking at a neocon's worst nightmare. So I know it's late, but it's great to be with you. And I'm hoping that there are members of the Wall Street Journal editorial board here so that they can learn something. Game on. In fact, I don't think there has been such a collection of common sense, populist, nationalist, conservative guts and intellectual horsepower in this room since my hero, Pat Buchanan, dined here alone. It is an honor, in turn, to honor the men and women who have made the American Conservative the indispensable journal to the conservative movement. As you know, yes, they deserve a round of applause. As you know, tonight's program has already showered thanks and praise on TAC's founders, its masthead, its writers, all of its staff, its outgoing leader, its board, and with good reason. The American Conservative's first issue in October 2002 came at a time that was fashionably called the end of America's holiday from history. Today, we know that moment is better understood as the middle of the American right having a holiday from conservatism. A generation hence, it must be said, the globalist ideological hubris that overtook the Washington Republican establishment at the end of the Cold War and still dominates elite institutions today was wrong from the beginning. It was never strategically sound. It was never recognizably conservative. It was never something that had a mandate from the American people. And it never overcame its inexcusable blind spot for and indifference to the struggles besetting working American families. And I'm here to issue the fraternal correction. It must also be said, including with some humility by me as a recovering neocon and now president of the Heritage Foundation, that for the last 20 years, there has been one major institution on the right consistently driving us back to our conservative roots, the American conservative. It's a testament to TAC's intellectual rigor and tenacity that in the last few years, the ideas of international realism, constitutional sovereignty, and economic patriotism have leapt from the pages of a bi-monthly magazine to the very center of American politics. No publication has so driven the national debate or won so many converts this past year. None has guided so many conservatives home to the principles and people our movement has always served and fought for. But even as we celebrate and thank TAC for its unprecedented successes these past 12 months, I come to this gala tonight not simply to praise the TAC family, but to challenge it. You know, I do so as a friend and as a supporter. And as I have written in TAC itself, I do as someone whose own misunderstanding is about the proper national security approach found his way largely because of consistently argued positions in the American conservative. Thus, my challenge is not for you to change what you're doing, but to do more of it. Because I believe the most important work this American conservative effort ever does will come in the next 12 months. From Ukraine to Israel, from the southern border to Iowa, New Hampshire, from Brussels to Belgium, from big tech to small towns, America's trajectory for the next decade and maybe the next generation will be set in motion before TAC's next annual gala. The same issues that for 30 years have tempted the United States to abandon its founding values and vital interests will reemerge with greater force than ever before. The same voices of globalism, elitism, and materialism that squandered our victory, Ambassador, in the Cold War, and severed the sacred bonds of trust between Americans and their government will again try to smear, marginalize, and demonize dissent, especially from the right. In these coming fights, it will not matter that the American conservative was, as its tagline says, right from the beginning. What will matter is whether TAC's writers, editors, and contributors are ready to help lead the post-neoconservative, post-globalist, post-corporatist, post-libertarian American right that TAC helped create. That the conservative movement has taken the long way home to ideas this magazine has espoused all along is a vindication, to be sure. But it is precisely in moments of vindication that we are most vulnerable to the pride and complacency that threaten everything that went into bringing out those moments in the first place. We know this first as students of human nature, but we know this too as observers of our own movement over the last 30 years. Those same temptations will soon confront the populist nationalist right as it finally takes its hard-won place at the head of the conservative movement at this uniquely dangerous moment in history. Success, then, requires the men and women in this room to see this moment, not as victory or vindication, but as an opportunity. The opportunity that generations of conservatives have fought for so long. It is an opportunity that may never well come again, and which we cannot afford to miss, like our generation of leaders did, plunging us into 3 decades of decadence, debt, and defeat, in spite of the sacrifices and heroism of all of our men and women in the armed forces. Remember just how this story began. In November 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, President George H.W. Bush's approval rating hit 70%. Soon it would reach 80 and even 90%. I remember the news journals being astonished. In November 1991, Saturday Night Live aired a skit about prominent Democrats smearing themselves in a debate parody titled Campaign 92, the race to avoid being the guy who loses to Bush. Yet a little over 2 months later, a syndicated newspaper columnist named Patrick Buchanan won 37% of the vote against the president in New Hampshire's Republican presidential primary. Buchanan's Granite State ambush was immediately dismissed by the press and the establishment as a fluke, the so-called death rattle of an old, backward conservatism of the past. Little did they know that it represented, in fact, the first breaths of a new, forward-looking conservatism of the future. As a young man living in Louisiana at the time, I knew this full well, having volunteered for his campaign and having volunteered for the largest campaign event for him in the country that year. Perhaps that correlated to him getting the highest percentage of the vote in any county in the country in my home parish of Lafayette, Louisiana. But I'm not here to take any credit. The official narrative of the 1990s says that it was driven by personalities: Bill and Hillary Clinton, Newt Gingrich, Al Gore, Monica Lewinsky, and the rest. But the superficial partisan soap operas of that era obscured and distracted the public from tectonic shifts in federal policy that upended our national life. All of them were shamefully bipartisan. That's right, I said they were shamefully bipartisan. Wield power when you have it. And most of them deliberately excluded the American people from providing meaningful input and accountability. First, there was President Bush in the lead up to the first Gulf War, unilaterally declaring a new world order to be governed by the United Nations and policed at its behest by the United States Armed Forces. There was the North American Free Trade Agreement, which gutted America's industrial Midwest and lit the fuse on an illegal immigration bomb still exploding to this very moment. The next year, another treaty created the World Trade Organization, wherein Washington surrendered America's economic sovereignty to globalist bureaucrats, just as our working class community stood to cash in their share of the Cold War peace dividend. Not that peace was on their menu. In 1993, Clinton sent U.S. troops into Mogadishu to referee the Somali Civil War, to infamous results in the Black Hawk Down debacle. He orchestrated a bombing campaign over the former Yugoslavia. All along, Clinton and his Republican counterparts on Capitol Hill turned most favored nation trading status with communist China into a bipartisan article of faith. And all along, the voices of America First nationalism, economic patriotism, and social conservatism were ignored, dismissed, or belittled. The same Washington establishment that celebrated serial predators in the Oval Office and the United States Senate condemned America First conservatives as being beyond the pale. And all of this was before George W. Bush and his team of neocon mediocrities and their dog-eared copies of the Weekly Standard as they strutted America into the successive catastrophes of Iraq, the financial crisis, No Child Left Behind, the Great Recession, and then the presidency of Barack Obama. Less than a generation since middle American hard hats and homemakers delivered the West's greatest international victory since World War II, America's economy, democracy, culture, prestige, and confidence lay in ruins, just as Buchanan conservatives had warned all along. In his speech announcing his rogue presidential campaign in 1991, Buchanan implored the Republican Party, "We call for a new patriotism where Americans begin to put the needs of Americans first. When we say we will put America first, we mean also that our Judeo-Christian values are going to be preserved, and our Western heritage is going to be handed down to future generations, not dumped into some landfill and multiculturalism." At his convention speech the following summer, Buchanan implored his party, "There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war. as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself. For this war is a war for the soul of America. He and conservatives around the country warned of the raw sewage of pornography before the internet. They warned of illegal immigration before NAFTA, and of the China shock before we poured trillions into a weaponized rival economy aimed right at our middle class. They questioned the Iraq War and were declared traitors for it. On every major policy dispute in this era, populist, nationalist conservatives pleaded with the Republican establishment to remember who and what they were supposed to defend. And at every turn, Washington elites sided with Wall Street, K Street, and Silicon Valley, and against the working men, women, and communities who comprised the party they led. This ends on a happy note. But I'm not done. And so today, our nation is beset by unprecedented crises around the world and, of course, here at home. Along our borders, on our crime-ridden streets, in our gas, grocery, and utility bills, in our toxic and atomized culture, in our exploding national debt and falling birth rates and life expectancy, in our empty churches, fatherless neighborhoods, failing schools, and overflowing prisons and mental health facilities. The bad news is, neither the Republican Party, nor the conservative movement, nor the American people can take mulligans on any of the failures that have led us here. But the good news is, we do have the opportunity now to learn from these mistakes as we work to forge a new governing agenda, a new coalition, and a vision for America's future. This work is essential on its own terms. Mandates should be earned, not counterfeited. But it will also answer, once and for all, that most insidious of all the slanders the establishment hurls at conservatives. Not that the ideas are wrong, nor even that we ourselves are deplorable. Rather, the cowardly, self-righteous lie that populist, nationalist, anti-establishment conservatives are uninterested in governing at all. That we don't have an agenda, just a grievance. That we are a nihilist peanut gallery, content to criticize the swamp's yes men in the arena from the safety of our backbench caucuses, think tanks, and magazines, one magazine in particular. Just because this slur is false doesn't mean, however, that we should ignore it. On the contrary, we ought to obliterate it. If the Republican establishment really thinks we can't produce a positive agenda or lead the national coalition they have misled for 30 years, get out of the way and let us get on with the work. Conservatives, now armed with our dog-eared copies of the American Conservative, stand ready to meet them anytime, any place, on any issue they please. And is it no coincidence that merely asking questions causes the establishment to go into a tizzy? Just ask another American treasure here tonight, my great friend Bridge Colby. Round of applause for that great American. A preview of the hopefulness in just a few moments is we are witnessing, we are party to the death throes of an establishment whose death is long overdue, and we get to be part of it. As the presidential primary of 2016, the speakers' races of 2023, and the clear direction of legislative and electoral momentum on the right demonstrate, we are in the fight and already doing more than simply holding our own. This shouldn't be the surprise it apparently still is to official Washington. After all, our vision for America's future, the American conservatives' vision, is and always has been America's vision too. The American people never asked for NAFTA. They never asked for the WTO. They never asked to import illegal immigrants or export manufacturing jobs. They never asked to surrender our sovereignty to the Supreme Court, to the administrative state, or international organizations of anti-American frauds and bigots. They didn't ask for same-sex marriage, for boys playing girls' sports, for defunding police departments, corporate bailouts, or a woke war against America's history and heritage. These ideas, if you think about it, were never proposed in open debate. They were imposed behind closed doors because leaders in both parties know all along their vision of elitist authoritarian globalism could never have won a mandate from the American people. Ours can, it has, and it will again. For ours is a vision of peace in the world, freedom at home, sovereignty under our Constitution, and solidarity with our fellow countrymen. We reject the default tyrannies of collectivism and cronyism favored by the Washington Uniparty. We demand a government that serves its people, not just some of them, and not the other way around. To those skeptics in the Republican Party who declare our values outside the boundaries of acceptable Reaganism, I would remind them of Reagan's words at his 1980 nominating convention, describing the GOP as, quote, a party ready to build a new consensus with all those across the land who share a community of values embodied in these words: family, work, neighborhood, peace, and freedom. The American conservative and those in the conservative movement are ascending not because of our vibes, but because of our values. We are inheriting the party of Lincoln because we embody the spirit of Reagan. It is precisely Reagan's spirit, humble, patriotic, loyal to, quote, ideas over ideology and principles over party, that we will need to lead our coalition and nation effectively, to succeed where a generation of Reagan's successors frankly failed. Ironically, the substance is the easy part. We don't need to start from scratch to develop the agenda that will help realize our popular patriotic vision of 21st century America. The American conservative has for 21 years hosted the constructive conservative policy debates that Republican leaders mostly ignored. Policy shops like the one I run are already working with elected leaders like Senator J.D. Vance, Senator Mike Lee, to turn these proposals into policy. And we welcome more of them to Washington. A more realistic national security policy is not rocket science. Just watch my colleague Rob Greenway on TV. All we need to do is reorient our international strategy toward our national interests. A generation of American globalism has made our world more dangerous and our nation less secure. Consider, Europe is at war, the Middle East too. Asia is dominated by a genocidal totalitarian superpower, now making strategic inroads in the Western Hemisphere, aided and abetted by some of our own policymakers. Migration crises are destabilizing 5 continents. Yet the institutions that were supposed to manage our new world order spend most of their time and budgets shrieking hatred at Viktor Orban, at Brexit, and of course now our Jewish brothers and sisters. Spare us, please, any more establishment platitudes about norms or about a rules-based order, whatever the hell that is, and definitely any more UN, or my favorite, EU resolutions. In this moment, it's the party of the status quo that is reckless, dangerous, and extreme. And yet, true to form, this crowd who in 2003 read Iraq skeptics out of polite society are now trying to do the same to anyone who asks what America's strategy in Ukraine might be. In lieu of presenting such a plan, President Biden and Leader McConnell want to tie U.S. aid to Israel to yet another blank check to Kiev. But I have good news on this front of national security realism. In spite of all their barbs, all their name-calling, all their intellectual dishonesty, all their fear-mongering, and all their finger-wagging, they're losing and we're winning. The reason why is obvious. The American people are on our side, and they always have been. Consider, for example, President Reagan's wisdom, dare I say, populism, in his January 1989 farewell address. He said, "Ours was the first revolution in the history of mankind that truly reversed the course of government, and with these 3 little words, we the people." We the people, Reagan continued, tell the government what to do. It doesn't tell us. We the people are the driver, The government is the car. And we decide where it should go and by what route and how fast. As Reagan would remind us if he were here tonight, to govern is to choose. And once again, Washington is choosing not to serve the nation's values, but to leverage them against our own values. Frustrating as uniparty globalist mischief like this may be, we must remember that it's not a perpetual motion machine like entitlement programs or teacher union contracts. As we saw under President Trump, national sovereignty and national security can be corrected and quickly to make our nation stronger and safer. It really is just a matter of political will. So too is economic reform. If presidents from Bush to Biden found it easier to make globalist policy unilaterally through treaties and regulations, so too is it easier to unmake them in the same way. With strong conservative leadership, China would never see another dime's worth of American investment, consumer spending, or access to our markets. Every American oil rig worker, thank you, every American oil rig worker, my people, quite literally, could be back at work tomorrow, and every woke busybody in the federal bureaucracy could be fired. Should have been Paul Dan's clapping first, but we'll see. The southern border could be secured and sanctuary cities and states defunded. Critical race theory could be, shall we say, canceled at American schools, government agencies, and in our military. In other words, a president could, in a single afternoon, leave unfavorable trade agreements and sovereignty-sapping international organizations. The federal government that has so far, for so long, put its thumb on the scale of big business, big banks, and big tech against working families could finally remove that fat thumb, getting out of the way of the plans, dreams, and initiative of everyday Americans. And despite the establishment's shameful inaction, there is much elected conservatives can do to use the power they have to heal America's cultural rot as well. Again, remember that the public stands with us and against elite lethargy and indifference. On pornography and big tech's conspiracy to addict our kids to screens and smut. On drugs and crime on our streets. On the sexualizing and grooming of children in our schools. On parents' rights and girls' and women's safety. On freedom of speech and religion. On the Second Amendment right to self-defense. On the need for more and better options than a bachelor degree from Woke U with $60,000 in student debt. We can revamp the welfare and tax systems to stop penalizing marriage, kids, and stay-at-home moms and start incentivizing them for the benefits they provide to society. The Heritage Foundation is proud to work with TAC on these major issues through Project 2025. Some of you know this story, but all of you should. Informed by 5 decades of the mandate for leadership, Heritage set out to create a program of goals, policies, individuals, and programs for the next conservative administration based on 3 initial observations. First, that the magnitude of these challenges we face requires a transition plan larger in scope than anything we've ever done before, because what we're confronting is larger in scope. Second, that a project this large could not, and frankly ought not, be the product of a single organization. Heritage could coordinate, but Project 2025's work required a real coalition of partner organizations almost as large as the conservative movement itself. We're proud to say that this coalition has grown to 75 plus strong, a true representation of our movement. And third, we knew that if we wanted Project 2025 to succeed as a political and also an intellectual endeavor, one of those partners had to be the American conservative. So once again, to Emil and your staff and your board, thanks for being a vital part of Project 2025. To close, if the policy battles ahead are the easy part and this moment of opportunity for the right, the hard part will be staying true to the ideas and especially to the people who got us here. Going forward, conservatives who are so accustomed to being ignored by the Republican Party will increasingly be in charge of it. Just witness the DC swamp political chatter in this city trying to make sense of Speaker Mike Johnson. It's a glorious time in the nation's capital. With that success will come temptation, however, complacency, entitlement, and hubris. That is the story of the last generation, how our own leaders sold out our republic's Cold War triumph for a mess of globalist pottage. But it's not the end of the story. And in the long arc of history, it may end up being only a footnote. Every day, more conservatives are turning their back on the leaders who betrayed them and returning to the fold, joining this fight against the Marxist left and the globalist elite. You see, the right is not lost. It never was. It's just taken the long way home. The long way home is how Pat Buchanan described his own endorsement of George H.W. Bush at the 1992 Republican Convention in Houston. His speech, which I cheered on from the convention floor as a college freshman, wearing a less than legal convention credential. I think statute of limitations have gone, but hell, that doesn't matter apparently anymore. In that speech, the comments, the substance, were mischaracterized as declaring a culture war in America, which everyone in America then as now knew he was only describing as a war well underway, started by someone else. A war of choice, in fact, launched by the left and the GOP elite against the working families their New World Order would leave behind. The decades that followed saw Republicans win control of Congress and dominate it since. They won the White House twice, and even finally secured a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. But look at our nation and at our world. Winning elections simply isn't enough. Neither is simply being right. There are no referees handing out awards to conservatives when we win Twitter debates against woke fanatics or Republican insiders. It's fun, but there are no awards. The great task remaining before us remains to bind up our nation's wounds, to rescue her sovereignty, our Constitution, and the rule of law, to restore her social solidarity and economic opportunity, to secure our borders from an illegal invasion and our culture from woke theocrats and globalist usurpation, and to do it all with the grit and the humility few successful political movements ever sustain after tasting political success. That is why the American conservatives' crowded hour is still ahead, and why the new populist nationalist conservative movement it helped create needs its flagship journal more than ever. And we know there's no institution or publication more able, or thank God, more willing, to tell us the hard truths we need to hear when we least want to. Like its founding editor, Mr. Buchanan, TAC has made its mark in the world by being a thorn in the side of elites who badly deserved one. As TAC ascends to its moment of opportunity and influence, it will need that same friendly thorn, that same filial correction, that same honest, incisive analysis. Just as the political establishment lost our trust over the last generation, this magazine has earned it. Through each issue, through each fight, and especially through each neocon barb and establishment purge. We reached this moment for one reason. They were wrong, and you were right. The establishment already proved the first point. Soon, we will have the chance to prove the second. We can, and I believe we will, as long as American conservatives stay true to the American conservative, and the American conservative stays true to itself, its vision, and to us. Together, we can show our movement and our country that the long way home was just the beginning of the right way forward. Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. That was fantastic. One more round of applause for Dr. Roberts and all of our speakers tonight. want to thank you all for joining us. It was almost 3 years ago now that I was humbled to be named to this position. And I wrote at the time that this is truly a special magazine with a unique role to play on the right. I believe that now more than ever. I think we've seen that tonight. And the future of this magazine truly is bright. So it's all thanks to you guys here. Again, we have the biggest gala that we have ever had here at the American Conservative. It was only a few short years ago that my predecessor, Johnny Burko, who's here tonight, conceived of this event and said, we need to have a big gala. We need to create a coalition here in DC. We cobbled together around 100 or so people at our first annual gala. So I'm thrilled to have all of you join us here this evening. And this is not quite the end of our evening yet. I hope that you will all join us at the bar, which will be open for just a little bit longer here at the Ritz. So they'll be right outside the door here. But again, I want to thank all of you for joining us. Thank all of our speakers. Thank all of our supporters who are here this evening. I hope to see all of you again next year. For me, at least, that will be, again, joining you out in the audience as a reader, a member, and a supporter. So thank all of you. And please join us at the bar. Good night.